I've stood in a lot like this before. Empty, quiet, unremarkable. The kind of place you'd never notice unless someone told you to look. But on the morning of January 15th, 1947, a mother pushing her child's stroller along South Norton Avenue in Los Angeles stopped suddenly. What she saw ahead of her didn't make sense at first. It looked like a discarded mannequin, a broken doll, something staged, something unreal. Then she got closer. And Los Angeles would never be the same again. I want you to imagine the city in 1947, sunlit streets, post-war optimism, Hollywood selling dreams by the reel. America had survived the war. The future felt wide open. But behind the palm trees and studio gates, something darker was waiting. The body in that vacant lot belonged to a young woman. She was cleaned, posed, and left on display like a message no one knew how to read. The precision of the crime told investigators one terrifying thing immediately. This wasn't random. This was personal. And whoever did this walked away calmly, possibly blending back into the same city that would obsess over the case for decades. The killer was never caught. No arrest. No conviction. No justice. And the question that still hangs over Los Angeles like a permanent fog is this. How does someone commit one of the most notorious murders in American history and simply disappear? Some believe the killer was protected. Others believe he was powerful. A few believe he was admired. Hollywood elites, doctors, socialites, men who wore suits by day and secrets by night. As an investigative journalist, I've spent years retracing this case, through police files, photographs, testimonies, and lies printed as headlines. And what haunts me most isn't just how Elizabeth Short died. It's how quickly the world forgot who she was. Before the nickname, before the myth, before the headlines turned her into a spectacle, there was a real woman here. Her name was Elizabeth Short. And she deserves to be remembered as more than a murder. Thanks for your time you always spend to watch our videos. We greatly value your support, so please share this video with your loved ones. Do us a favor and subscribe right away, regardless of where you are watching. Let's dive into the story of the Black Dahlia murder, 1947. For something better waiting somewhere else. Friends described her as polite, soft-spoken, and romantic. She wasn't reckless. She wasn't wild. Despite what tabloids later claimed, there's no evidence she lived a life of excess. What she did have was a dream, a simple one, shared by thousands of young women at the time. She wanted to be seen. Hollywood, in the 1940s, was a promise machine. You could arrive with nothing and leave with everything, or so the studios wanted you to believe. Elizabeth moved west chasing that promise, drifting between friends' couches, short-term jobs, and small additions that never quite led anywhere. She struggled with asthma and poor health. Money was always tight. But she tried to stay hopeful. What strikes me most, reading letters and accounts from people who knew her, is how normal she was. No criminal record. No history of violence. No known enemies. Just a young woman moving from place to place, trusting people too easily in a city that rewarded trust with cruelty. The nickname, the Black Dahlia, didn't exist while Elizabeth was alive. It was invented after her death. Reporters, desperate for a headline, borrowed the name from a popular noir film, The Blue Dahlia. They twisted Elizabeth's appearance, her dark hair, her clothing, into something sinister. They painted her as seductive, dangerous, and immoral. It sold papers. But it wasn't true. Elizabeth Short was not a femme fatale. She was not a scandal. She was not asking for what happened to her. She was alone. And in January 1947, she was last seen alive in a city that would turn her death into entertainment. A city watching, before the end. In the days leading up to her murder, Elizabeth was moving through Los Angeles quietly. She stayed with acquaintances. She made phone calls. She told people she planned to visit her sister soon. No one reported an argument. No one reported fear. No one reported threats. That absence of warning is one of the most unsettling aspects of this case. Because it suggests something even darker, she trusted the person who killed her. When police began reconstructing her final days, they found fragments, sightings at bars, hotel lobbies, and sidewalks. But no clear path. No steady timeline. Just a woman fading in and out of a crowded city. And then, suddenly, she was gone. What happened next would expose not just a killer but the weaknesses of an entire system. The shadow begins. The LAPD arrived at the vacant lot within hours of the discovery. Officers quickly realized this was no ordinary homicide. The crime scene showed planning, control, and time. Too much time. The body had been carefully arranged. Nothing was stolen. There were no signs of a struggle at the site itself, which meant the murder didn't happen there. Elizabeth had been killed somewhere else, and transported. That realization sent a chill through investigators, because it meant the killer had a private space, a secure location, and the confidence to move undetected. From the very beginning, this case demanded answers the police were not prepared to give. And within hours, the press arrived. Then came the crowds, the cameras, the rumors. Elizabeth Short's name would soon be replaced by something more marketable. Something darker. Something that would follow her forever. As I dug deeper into the early hours of the investigation, one detail stood out. Something the public didn't fully grasp at the time. Before the police could even understand what they were dealing with, the killer had already made his next move. And it wasn't toward hiding. It was toward attention. The crime scene. Unsettling details. By the time I first studied the crime scene photographs, decades after they were taken, one thing was immediately clear to me. This wasn't just murder. It was deliberate choreography. The vacant lot on South Norton Avenue was open and exposed, bordered by sidewalks and modest homes. Whoever placed Elizabeth Short there wanted her to be seen. Not hidden. Not buried. Displayed. Police quickly confirmed what the first witness had sensed instinctively. Elizabeth's body had been cleaned. There was no blood pooled at the scene. No signs of a struggle. No footprints were preserved properly before crowds trampled through the area, which meant the crime happened somewhere else. Somewhere controlled. Somewhere private. The precision disturbed investigators. The body had been carefully arranged. The positioning suggested time, patience, and familiarity with anatomy. This was not the work of panic. This was not rage spiraling out of control. This was the intention. And intention implies confidence. What police didn't know that morning was even more dangerous than what they did. They had no murder weapon. No witnesses. No clear timeline. No confirmed last contact. And worst of all, they had no idea how long Elizabeth had been in the killer's possession. That uncertainty would haunt the investigation from the very beginning. What police knew, and what they didn't. In 1947, forensic science was limited. DNA analysis didn't exist. Evidence collection relied heavily on procedure and discipline. Two things the LAPD would soon prove it lacked under pressure. Investigators believed the killer had medical or surgical knowledge. The cuts were clean, controlled, unhurried. But belief is not proof. And proof is what they needed. Instead, what they got was noise. Within hours, reporters flooded the scene. By the next day, Elizabeth Short's death was front-page news across the country. Her name was barely mentioned. The nickname came first. The Black Dahlia. Once the press took control of the narrative, the case became something else entirely. Not an investigation. A spectacle. I've read the internal LAPD memos from those early days. You can feel the tension bleeding through the typewritten pages. Officers were overwhelmed. Leads poured in faster than they could be verified. Tips contradicted one another. Witnesses misremembered details, or invented them entirely. And then came the letters. The killer writes back. Just days after the body was discovered, An envelope arrived at a Los Angeles newspaper. Inside were Elizabeth Short's personal belongings. Cleaned. Carefully arranged. Accompanied by a message. When I first read about this moment, I felt something I've only felt a few times in my career. A deep, instinctive dread. Because this wasn't arrogance. It was control. The killer wasn't hiding. He wasn't running. He was watching the coverage. Reading the headlines. Anticipating police moves. And he was confident enough to reach out. This single act confirmed investigators' worst fear. They weren't chasing a suspect. They were reacting to a narrator. Someone who wanted to shape the story. From that moment on, the investigation was no longer in the hands of law enforcement alone. The media had become an active participant, and not a helpful one. False confessions. A case drowning in lies. Something strange happens when a murder becomes famous. People want to be part of it. The LAPD would eventually receive dozens of confessions, men claiming responsibility for Elizabeth Short's murder. Some were mentally ill. Some wanted attention. Some simply wanted to see if they could fool the police. Each confession took time. Each required verification. Each drained resources. And every false lead pushed the truth further away. I've read transcripts of these confessions. Many were detailed, convincing at first glance. But when investigators checked timelines, locations, or physical capability, the stories fell apart. Still, the damage was done. The case was splintering. And with every passing day, public pressure mounted. The city demanded answers. Hollywood whispered. And the LAPD began to crack. Media interference. Justice undermined. The press didn't just report the case. They reshaped it. Reporters published unverified details, some accurate, many not. They portrayed Elizabeth Short as reckless, promiscuous, and morally suspect. It was easier to sell tragedy if the victim could be blamed. That distortion mattered, because it influenced how people talked to police, how witnesses remembered events, how jurors, if there had ever been a trial, might have judged her worth. As an investigative journalist, I've learned that once a narrative hardens, facts struggle to survive. And in 1947, the narrative was already poisoned. Behind the scenes, LAPD leadership argued over jurisdiction, resources, and strategy. Evidence was mishandled. Leads were dropped. Files were lost or improperly archived. The case was still young. And already, it was slipping away. A pattern of failure. What haunts me most is this. The Black Dahlia case didn't collapse because it was impossible to solve. It collapsed because it was mishandled at every critical moment. Crowds contaminated the crime scene. Media leaks compromised leads. Egos interfered with coordination. Public pressure forced haste where patience was needed. And somewhere in Los Angeles, a killer watched it all unfold. Calmly, confidently, knowing that chaos was his greatest ally. By the time investigators realized the case was spiraling out of control, something even more unsettling emerged. A pattern. A circle of names that kept resurfacing. Doctors, businessmen, socialites. Men with education, influence, and access to private spaces. Men who knew how to avoid suspicion. Men who looked nothing like monsters. What if the killer was known, but untouchable? The suspects, doubt and suspicion. Every unsolved case eventually reaches a moment where investigators stop asking what happened and start asking something far more dangerous. Who could get away with it? When I examined the Black Dahlia files, one thing stood out immediately. The most persistent suspects weren't drifters or criminals pulled from the margins of society. They were educated, respected, connected. Men who understood anatomy. Men who owned property. Men who knew how systems fail, and how to hide inside those failures. That reality terrified investigators, even if they never said it out loud. Because accusing a nobody is easy. Accusing someone powerful is something else entirely. The doctor theory. One theory surfaced again and again, both inside and outside police circles. The killer had medical knowledge. The precision of the crime suggested familiarity with the human body. The lack of panic. The control. The patience. This led investigators to quietly examine doctors, surgeons, and medical students, men who had the skill and the private space to commit such an act without detection. Among them was Dr. George Hodel. Hodel was wealthy, intelligent, socially connected. His home had been a gathering place for artists, intellectuals, and Hollywood elites. On the surface, he was untouchable. Years later, his own son, a former LAPD detective, would accuse him of being the Black Dahlia killer. That accusation didn't come lightly. It came after years of re-examining evidence, recordings, photographs, and family history, including disturbing statements allegedly captured on secret police wiretaps. Statements that, if taken at face value, suggested guilt. But here's where the case fractures. Nothing definitively ties Hodel, or any other suspect, to the murder in a way that would stand in court. Suspicion is not proof, and proof is what justice demands. Other names, other shadows. Hodel wasn't alone. Other suspects surfaced over the years, men with violent pasts, men who confessed and recanted, men whose timelines almost fit, but never quite locked into place. Some had motive but no opportunity. Some had opportunity but no motive. Some simply felt right, until facts intervened. That's the curse of cold cases. The longer they go unsolved, the easier it becomes to project meaning where certainty doesn't exist. As a journalist, I'm obligated to sit with that discomfort, to resist the urge to solve the case emotionally, because the truth doesn't bend for our need for closure. The media circus, a case consumed. By the late 1940s, the Black Dahlia murder had escaped the control of law enforcement entirely. It belonged to the public now. Newspapers competed for the most shocking angle. Writers embellished Elizabeth's life. Fiction blurred into fact. Rumors hardened into legends. Elizabeth Short became a symbol, not a person. And once that happened, something irreversible occurred. The investigation stopped being about justice. It became about myth. The press didn't just report on the case. They rewrote it. They sensationalized her appearance, her friendships, her morality. They implied she lived dangerously, which subtly suggested she died that way too. That narrative didn't just harm her memory. It protected the killer. Because when a victim is blamed, urgency fades. Lost evidence, lost time. Years passed. Files were misplaced. Photographs degraded. Witnesses died. Memories faded. Every cold case reaches a point where the truth isn't just hidden. It's eroded. I've spoken to detectives who worked the case decades later. They all say the same thing, in different words. If we'd had today's tools back then, this might have been solved. But hindsight doesn't resurrect justice. And technology can't replace integrity. What if they knew? Here's the question I keep returning to, one that no file can answer. What if someone did know who killed Elizabeth Short? What if the truth surfaced quietly and was dismissed? What if the suspect was simply too connected, too respected, and too dangerous to confront? Los Angeles in the 1940s was a city of secrets. Corruption wasn't unheard of. Power didn't always answer to morality. And when power intersects with violence, silence often follows. By the time the Black Dahlia case went cold, it had transformed into something else entirely. Not just an unsolved murder, but a mirror, reflecting how systems fail victims when spectacle outweighs truth. That doesn't mean Elizabeth Short has been forgotten. The unanswered questions, a cold case that never slept. Every cold case reaches a moment where the paper trail ends. I reached that moment late one night, surrounded by scanned police reports, aging photographs, and margin notes written by detectives long since buried. I remember leaning back and asking myself the question every investigator eventually has to face. What if this is all there will ever be? No confession that holds. No evidence strong enough to indict. No courtroom. No verdict. Elizabeth Short's case never officially closed. It simply exhausted the system meant to protect her. Key evidence vanished or degraded. Early mistakes could never be undone. Witnesses who might have clarified timelines passed away. Suspects aged out of scrutiny or died without ever being charged. Justice didn't lose in one dramatic moment. It eroded quietly. And yet, something about this case refuses to rest. Contradictions that still haunt. The more I studied the Black Dahlia murder, the clearer it became that its contradictions are what keep it alive. A killer who craved attention, but vanished. A crime that suggested expertise, but left no forensic trail. A victim who was everywhere and nowhere in her final days. Elizabeth moved through Los Angeles without anchors. She trusted people. She accepted rides. She believed the city might still offer her something better. That openness, so ordinary, so human, may have been what made her vulnerable. And that's the part we often avoid acknowledging. Not because it excuses the crime, but because it reminds us how fragile safety really is. What justice means when a name is never spoken. We often define justice narrowly, as a conviction, a sentence, or a prison door closing behind someone. But not all cases allow that ending. So we have to ask a harder question. Can justice exist without a verdict? In Elizabeth Short's case, justice begins with truth. Truth about who she was. Truth about how she lived. Truth about how she was treated, both in life and in death. For decades, she was reduced to a nickname. A headline. A symbol of noir-era horror. That reduction was a second injustice. And undoing it matters. The real legacy of the Black Dahlia. The Black Dahlia case changed American crime reporting forever. It exposed how media sensationalism can contaminate investigations. How misogyny shapes public sympathy. How institutions buckle under pressure. How power protects itself. Because of this case, policing standards evolved. Evidence handling improved. Media ethics, however imperfectly, were questioned. Elizabeth Short did not choose to become a lesson. But her story forced change. And that matters. The hero's history overlooked. When people talk about the Black Dahlia, they rarely talk about the quiet heroes. The detectives who worked the case long after headlines faded. The journalists who pushed back against false narratives. The historians who re-examined facts instead of repeating myths. The family members who endured decades of speculation and pain. Justice is not always loud. Sometimes it's persistence. Sometimes it's refusal. Sometimes it's telling the story correctly, over and over, until distortion loses its power. A final reflection. When I think about Elizabeth Short now, I don't picture the vacant lot. I picture a young woman standing on a Los Angeles sidewalk, suitcase nearby, believing tomorrow might be better than yesterday. That belief was never the crime. The crime was what was done to her. And the failure wasn't that her killer was never convicted. The failure was how quickly the world decided her life was worth less than the story told about her death. The haunting ending. A question that remains. Somewhere in Los Angeles, the truth existed once, whole, clear, undeniable. Whether it died with the killer, or was buried under fear and silence, we may never know. But here is what can be known. Elizabeth Short was not a myth. She was not a nickname. She was not a cautionary tale invented by headlines. She was a human being. And remembering her truth is an act of justice. Because even when the law fails, memory can still hold the line. Final tribute and lesson. This story doesn't end with handcuffs. It ends with responsibility. Responsibility to protect the vulnerable. Responsibility to challenge narratives that dehumanize victims. Responsibility to remember that behind every true crime story is a real life that mattered. Elizabeth Short deserved safety. She deserved dignity. She deserved justice. And while the killer may have escaped the law, he did not escape history. Thanks for watching. Watch out for more of a true crime story. Subscribe to the Famographic Show.